Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who's new to my channel or new to this podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be violent or graphic content. Listener discretion is advised. I'm so sorry it's taken me this long to come back to a new episode. Moving and setting up a new house takes a lot of time, as you can all imagine. You guys can obviously see that I'm in a new space, in a new office. I'm in a swanky new office space for myself, and I've got a little reading nook. I bought off Amazon one of those rotating bookshelves, and it is fabulous, guys. It is awesome. I absolutely love it. I saw it on TikTok and I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be one of those things. And it was over $100. So I was like, I better really enjoy this. Absolutely love it. By the way, in Melbourne at the moment, it is boiling. It's not boiling, but it's like weeks on end at the moment of 30 degrees, and everybody in Melbourne's not really used to this kind of summer weather. And I mean Celsius. I don't mean Fahrenheit. So obviously all my American viewers go and look up 30 degrees Celsius. I think it's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I can't remember. I'll also be filming all of my podcasts in here, and I guess you guys can already see that though. So I imagine you'll probably see a little bit more of the animals now. They like to sit here with me in this little space. Now you can't see the map as well as you used to, as it kind of sits behind my head. I'm going to try and find a better place for that. I don't know if I can maybe put up a screen there, and then it can be sort of situated there so you guys can sort of see it. You can see my Hollywood picture that I got in my teenage years. I do love that golden age of Hollywood. Once again, though, I do get sidetracked so easily. Anybody who knows me knows that I get sidetracked really easily. So let's talk about this week's episode. By the way, I've severely missed doing my podcast and all of my research. I hope you guys are glad that I'm back. Comment down there to say welcome back, or comment if you want to. I'd love to hear from you guys, though. So this week I'm going to be doing another feature episode, and this one I'm going to be talking about the Toolbox Killers. Once again, guys, this is a serial killer that's in California. It seems to be a real hunting ground for serial killers, especially Southern California, and especially sort of during this time, especially in the 70s where it was free love, it was a lot of hitchhiking, all that kind of circumstance. So let's be real. If I was being completely honest, I probably could have done a podcast on serial killers alone in Southern California. And it would probably be around the same amount of episodes. So it's one of those things that I don't know if it's just me or if I've just never really thought about it as much. But it definitely feels like to me that this could have been I'm guessing a podcast on California itself. So it's one of those things that if you guys would like me to possibly look into doing more serial killers in Southern California, I could probably do that. But I did read a really interesting fact that 10% of serial killers kill in California. So that fact alone is pretty scary to me. Further into this episode, I do get into a little bit more specifics on who was around at that time. So tune in. Let's keep going. So this particular duo is actually pretty gruesome. How do I say this? Some say that part of this duo, he wanted to actually be bigger than Charles Manson. And on the topic of Charles Manson, has anybody watched the new documentary on Netflix? It's actually really interesting. So if you do get an opportunity, go and watch it. He's one guy that I would love to do a feature episode on. Comment below if that's something that you'd be interested in seeing. Now, remember when I did an episode on the Toolbox Killer? I got these guys mixed up after watching a documentary on them. So if you get a chance, go and watch the documentary called The Toolbox Killer. It's on Hiu in Australia. I'm not sure if it's a documentary in America, but I think it was on Oxygen. So if you guys get a chance, go and watch it. It's got some really creepy interviews with one of them, and you'll discover just how gross he can actually be. I'll do a bio on both. So Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris would be eventually known as the Toolbox Killers. Now, Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September 27th in 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he was adopted by Mr. and Mrs. George Bittaker. Now, there is some real conflicting information on his childhood. According to some, he was an unwanted child of a couple who had chosen that they didn't really want to have kids. Then you've got that he had a teenage mother, his dad was abusive, and that his mum ended up giving him away to family members. I'm not really sure which one is the truth, and I don't know if I definitely think, though, it's probably more likely that he had a teenage mum, because he definitely talks about in his interviews how he actually ended up sort of wanting to kill his mum because of the neglect and the abandonment that she had put on him as such a baby, and what he had witnessed. So I'm not really sure, guys, but apparently, and according to, there was frequent moves due to George's work that led to a bit of an upheaval for Lawrence himself. He would end up dropping out of school in 1957. He was soon arrested in Long Beach for auto theft, a hit and run, evading arrest, resulting in him having some time in a California youth authority until he was 19 years old. Now, pretty much after he's paroled out of this, he was arrested by the FBI in Louisiana for violating the Interstate Motor Vehicle Theft Act. He's convicted in 1959. He was sentenced to 18 months at a federal reformatory in Oklahoma. His behaviour led to a transfer to the U.S. Medical Center in Missouri, and from where doctors would release him after he only served like 2/3 of his sentence. Now, he's arrested in LA for robbery in December 1960. He was convicted in May 1961, and he's sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. Now, during this time, right, a psychiatric examination would occur and found that he was manipulative with considerable concealed hostility, and they label him as borderline psychotic and basically paranoid. Despite all of this, he's paroled in late 1963 after serving just a small amount of his sentence. His freedom would be really brief, though, guys. He would end up going back to jail 2 months later for a parole violation and a suspicion of robbery. Another parole violation would send him back to prison in 1964. And in 1966, he even admitted that stealing made him feel important and blaming his actions on circumstances beyond his control. Once again, he is diagnosed with a borderline psychosis, but he's released again, but he's going to violate his parole in 1967. A month later, he was caught for a theft and a hit and run, which would result in a 5-year sentence, but he was paroled 3 years later in April 1970. In March 1971, he's arrested for burglary and a parole violation, leading to another conviction in October, but with a sentence of 6 months to 15 years. Now, the California prison system at that time was in a real disarray that it was hardly surprising, but once again, he's freed in 1974. His next crime began as simply shoplifting, shoving a steak down the front of his pants in a supermarket, but it escalated to attempted murder in the parking lot, where he would stab the employee who'd actually tried to stop him from shoplifting. Now, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Robert Markham examined Lawrence before trial and disagreed with earlier findings of a borderline psychosis. He would actually diagnose him as a sociopath. So in his memoir, Alone with the Devil, Markman actually explained that his diagnosis meant that Bittaker had difficulty adhering to society rules. He would not learn from any experience and repeatedly would engage in unacceptable and deviant behaviour. In short, he was a hopeless case beyond any known treatment or rehabilitation. Now, this particular doctor, Dr. Markham, also warned that Lawrence was bound to escalate in his criminal behaviour and he would move on eventually to some very serious crimes. He's a highly dangerous man with no internal controls over his impulses, a man who would kill without hesitation or remorse. Now, Bittaker later reinforced this by telling a cellmate that he had planned on being bigger than Charles Manson. I don't know if it's just me, but there are some really, really clear signs every time he's committing a crime that he is getting worse and he is escalating. Yet it is so ignored in this justice system that I don't understand it. It's really odd for me that this is not something that they're even engaging in. Psychiatrists are red flags up the wazoo, but they're still releasing him. Like, how do you, in your head, justify that at all? You've let this man go how many upteen times to commit more crimes? I just don't understand it, guys. Prison psychiatrists assessed him more in 1977. An evaluation indicated that it was more than likely that he's going to commit new crimes upon release. In July 1978, another psychiatrist described Bittaker as a sophisticated psychopath with guarded at best prospects for a successful parole. Despite all of these warnings, he's released in 1978. But before he was released, he formed a connection with someone. And can you guess who that connection is? So we've got Roy Lewis Norris. He was born in Colorado on February 2nd in 1948. In contrast to Lawrence, though, he resided in his small hometown until the age of 17. Apparently, he left school and he would enlist in the Navy. He was stationed in San Diego, but he spent 4 months in Vietnam in 1969. Although he didn't engage in any combat, he certainly engaged in some drugs, particularly marijuana, and apparently it became really accessible. And that was his drug of choice. We will find out later, how it came about. Now, back in Southern California, by November 1969, he attacked a female driver in downtown San Diego. He forced his way into her car and attempted rape. It took only 3 months for him to get arrested again. He's free on bail. He's pending trial for attacking a motorist. He knocked on another woman's door in San Diego and he asked if he could use her telephone. Now, when the woman flat out refused, he actually tried to break in through a living room window. He then ran around the back to the kitchen. It was there that he broke a window and he finally entered the house. But police thankfully arrived before he could do anything to his intended victim. Now, that must have been absolutely terrifying for that woman. Like, some dudes knocked on her door and she's just expected to let him in. Now, in response to his deviant behaviour, the Navy discharged him for psychological problems after diagnosing him with a severe schizoid personality. Now, while awaiting the outcome of his assault cases, he attacked another young woman at the San Diego College in May 1970. He would assault her with a stone and he repeatedly slammed her head against the sidewalk. Now, this led to a charge with assault with a deadly weapon. He was then committed to Atascadero State Hospital as a mentally disordered sex offender. Now, if I remember correctly, I think Edmund Kemper was also assigned to this person, to this exact same state hospital. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But after 5 years, he was released on probation, with authorities deeming him no longer a threat to others. He was cruising around on his motorbike, though, 3 months later, when he raped a 27-year-old woman in Redondo Beach after she'd had a fuck with her boyfriend. She somehow came into contact with Norris. Police were unable to charge him, though, due to she only gave a vague description. A month later, the woman remembered his license plate, though, and actually found him. So, convicted of forcible rape, Norris was sent to the California men's colony at St. Louis. He met a friend who would end up changing his life. This is where a dangerous pair would come up with plans to rape and torture women that they deemed that deserved it. So Bittaker's been paroled in November 1978, and he's returned to Los Angeles, where he's gainfully employed as a machinist. Norris was released almost 2 months later in January 1979. Now, he moved in with his mother at an LA trailer park and obtained work as an electrician because that was what he was trained in at the Navy. In February 1979, Bittaker would actually write to Norris, arranging for them to meet in a downtown hotel. And it was here that they would reconnect over drinking and smoking some pot, and they discussed what they were going to do to the women of Southern California. I don't know what would possess you to think that meeting up with your cellmate, because I'm pretty sure that's a parole violation, and then discussing all the sadistic ways you are going to sexually violate women. This is the level of grossness that these two actually decided was a good idea. It's one of those things to me, right, that I just get so annoyed, guys. This is just next level. Like, these guys have shown some pretty severe cases of criminal behavior and pretty sadistic criminal behavior in some cases, and yet somehow they keep getting released and no threat to society. So spring is approaching Southern California. It's going to be what we call hunting season for the women of Southern California, and they had no idea what was coming their way. Now, before I discuss the murders, it's important to provide some context about Southern California during this period. It's really become a center of activity almost for criminal behavior. It's contributing significantly to the world's serial killers from 1950 to 2000. These individuals have become well known and often referred to with names created for media purposes. The Night Stalker, the I-5 Killer, the Skid Row Slasher, the Hillside Strangler, the Freeway Killer, the Koreatown Slasher, the Candlelight Killer, the Southside Slayer, the Trash Bag Killer, the Sunset Slayer, and the Orange Coast Killer are just some of the names that are marked in Southern California during this time of the 1970s. Is sort of, it's really prominent, right? Like in the 1960s, almost through to the 1990s, probably even more, and even now. And look, I get it. I am the one, I also sit here and talk about serial killers. So I sit here and I don't know if I want to use the word memorialize them or but I am captivated by them. It is, I guess it's that somewhat of that darkness that you kind of want to try to understand how humans can be that depraved, because you as a normal human being don't want to engage in deviant and this type of behavior, but you do certainly sort of want to understand it to a certain degree, right? Like, I think it's normal for us to want to understand it a little bit better. Anyway, back to our timeline. For the pair to abduct teenage girls, they decided they would need a van as opposed to a cart. Would just make it easier. With some money he got from Norris as well, he bought a silver grey 1977 GMC Vandura. It's in the background now, guys. So this van was windowless on one side and it had a large sliding door on the passenger side. He noted that they could pull up to teenage girls without fully opening the doors. They even nicknamed the van Murder Mac. It's absolutely revolting. So from February to June 1979, they'd drive along the Pacific Coast Highway. They'd stop at beaches. They would talk and interact with some of the girls, taking photos. Now, Norris would estimate that they picked up around 20 women without causing them any harm before they did anything. Detectives would later find approximately 500 photos of unidentified young women among Bittaker's belongings. Now, they were obviously not aware that their photos were being taken, guys. There were test runs. The rape and murder could wait until they'd really found the perfect isolated spot to take their victims. In late April 1979, the hunters discovered a secluded fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains near Glendora. Now, so Lawrence Bittaker actually broke a padlock with a crowbar that would gain them access. Now, all they really needed to do, unfortunately, was find a girl to take them to this secluded spot. Now, they would find their first victim on June 24th, 1979, and they would find their last victim on Halloween of the same year. In total, whilst there's only 5 victims, the terror that they caused over just these 4 months was appalling, and the way they degraded the women that they attacked. Now, there is definitely, I would say, more victims, and I just don't know if they've been able to find them. I don't know if they've been reported. I don't know if there is a circumstance of them, especially during this time, picking up sex workers and possibly missing girls that they've just never been able to find bodies. So I just don't know. I do suspect there are more victims. Bittaker and Norris would murder their first victim, a 16-year-old Lucinda Lynn Schaffert. Now, she preferred to be called Cindy, and this is in June 1979. She was last seen leaving the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Redondo Beach. In most of his accounts of the day, Bittaker actually stated that he and Norris had finished constructing the bed installed in the rear of the van, and beneath that they would place tools, clothes, and a cooler filled with beer and soft drinks. So at approximately 11 a.m., they're driving around the beach area, they're drinking beer, they're smoking weed, and they're flirting with girls. But according to the documentary that I watched, he actually said that they'd been driving around for about 15 hours before they picked up Cindy, and they'd been drinking and they'd been smoking weed. Now, this feels like to me that they're leading up to knowing what they're going to do something. So it feels like they've numbed themselves a little bit beforehand, or maybe that's, I don't know, their way to get themselves riled up. Maybe I'm just giving them too much credit. I don't really know. But after several attempts to try and lure Cindy into the van by offering her marijuana or a ride home, she's a good girl, I might add, guys. She's never going to get in a van with 2 strangers. So they would drive a little further ahead and park next to a driveway. It was then that Norris opened up the sliding door on the passenger door, leaned out of the van, so his head and shoulders were sort of obscured. But he actually waited until she was past the van, and he grabbed her and pulled her into the vehicle. And he shut the door really quickly behind them. Now, Bittaker would actually turn up the radio really loud while Norris was actually binding her arms and her legs, and he would also gag her mouth with duct tape. This would actually become a bit of a pattern with them, that they would turn on the music really loud and they'd bound and gag their victims. He ends up driving to that secluded road he'd found earlier and parked out of sight. Now, the men made small talk until they were sort of tired of that routine, and they would order this young 16-year-old girl to strip. Now, Bittaker left the van for about an hour or so, and he said he was giving Norris some privacy. He then came back and they took turns in raping this poor girl. In custody months later, each of them accused each other of who wanted to strangle her first. Apparently, Norris actually bungled it and couldn't actually kill the victim. He actually had left to vomit. And so I think some part of me goes, well, at least he showed some signs of remorse and not wanting to actually kill a victim. But while this was going on, Bittaker began choking Cindy, but he couldn't seem to finish the job. So according to Lawrence, he then handed Norris a coat hanger and they twisted it around her neck and tightened it with pliers. Now, this is the first time they're sort of using those tools in the van and all that kind of stuff. That's why they're called the Toolbox Killers, because they used anything available in a toolbox. Now, they would dispose of her body in a plastic shower curtain and dump her into a very deep canyon. They believed that the animals would take care of the remains, and while the crime felt nearly perfect to them, they definitely agreed that something was missing and decided that they would keep a trophy from the next killing. Unfortunately for Cindy's family, her body has never been recovered, and that's just really unfortunate because there's no closure for her family in respect to that. Now, just 2 weeks after the murder of Cindy, because that's her preferred name, and I'd like to call our victims by their preferred names, Andrea Joy Hall had no idea that hitchhiking that day would lead to her demise. Now, the pair would follow a car that picked her up originally. Clearly, they were wanting this to feel a little bit more like a hunt, but as soon as she's exited the other vehicle, they'd use this time to grab her. Now, Norris would actually end up hiding as to lure the victim without knowing that two men were in the murder mac. Just excuse me for a second. I'm just going to take a sip of my water as well. Now, Andrea thanks Lawrence for picking her up. She introduces herself and accepts his offer of a cold drink. She ends up grabbing a soda from the cooler in the back of the van, and she returns to her seat. Norris would come out from hiding then, and he'd grab her. More struggling on the floor would incur of the murder mac, more loud music from the radio as he's driving. She fought really hard for her life, and Norris was just too strong. He would twist an arm behind her back until she finally surrendered. This enabled him to bind her wrists and her ankles and cover her mouth with tape. Now, they didn't even bother with small talk with Andrea. She was repeatedly raped by both men, like Cindy, and when both were done, such a horrible expression for me to say, by the way, so I really apologize. I know that's not the way that I want to word it. I just don't know how else to word it. Lawrence ended up loading up his Polaroid camera and drags her from the van. And he sends Norris on a beer run down the mountain to a small convenience store. Now, when Norris returned, he found Bittaker alone, smiling over photos of Andrea, and her face is just contorted with fear from these photos. He told me that he told her he was going to kill her, and he wanted to see what her argument would be for staying alive. He said that she didn't put up much of an argument, and that's why he had killed her. Bittaker would end up telling Norris that he'd stabbed Hall twice with an ice pick, one in each ear, but he had to strangle her because it didn't actually kill her. I do not know how you be that cold and that unremorseful that you've just done that and you've violated someone like that. She would actually be pushed off the cliff as well, and unfortunately for her, her body has never been found. So we're just seeing a really big pattern of them not being very remorseful at all. Now, on our third and fourth victim was in September 1979. So there's quite a gap between the second and third and fourth murders. So I suspect there are some victims that perhaps haven't been found or reported. Men like these two, they don't just stop. I know this sounds really cold, but I've done a couple of these episodes now, and it just doesn't often happen that this cooling off period can be this long. And especially for these two are gunning each other on, right? Now, whilst I think definitely that Lawrence was the power man and that Norris was the sort of, what would you call, the subduer? No. Dominant and submissive. So Lawrence is the dominant and definitely Norris is the submissive. But I think at times that those roles sometimes reversed, but I definitely think with Lawrence having an IQ of 138, he definitely used that to his advantage and used it to manipulate Norris. Now, while they're driving through Hermosa Beach, they spot two girls at a bus stop, Jackie Gilliam and Leah Camp. Now, I believe they were 13 and 15. They weren't waiting for a bus, so they seemed to actually be quite happy to, accept a ride with no real special destination in mind. Bittaker and Norris later actually told police that the girls were also glad to accept Lawrence's offer to smoke a joint. Now, after sparking up, the joint was passed around and he told both of the girls that they're heading to the beach. Though Jackie and Leah challenged him pretty much straight away, as he was actually driving in the opposite direction to the ocean. He definitely stalled them with excuses, though, and he was claiming that he just wanted to find a safe place near a park so that they could get high. The girls pretty much fought that when he parked near a suburban tennis court. Now, Leah started to open the door, and Norris was unfortunately just faster. He hit her and briefly knocked her unconscious before he would overpower Jackie. Now, a fight followed really quickly that would lead to both girls being subdued and tied up with duct tape. Now, once they were secured and silenced, they'd actually noticed that several of the tennis players were watching. Now, fearing that someone was going to call the police, he sped off towards that hideout in the San Gabriel Mountains. However, no one actually ended up calling the police, and witnesses ended up returning to their games and dismissed the incident. Just give me 1 second, guys. She just wants to go outside, so just give me a second. So, the girls were actually kept alive for 2 days. They kept an audio tape of the rape and torture that they put these girls through. But among other things, it captured Norris raping Jackie and demanding that she play a role of the cousin that he wanted to, who was pretty much an object of some of his disgusting sexual fantasies. Lawrence would actually end up murdering the girls once again with ice picks, stabbing Gilliam in both ears. But as with Andrea, it made her scream, but it actually failed to kill her. So they took turns in strangling Jackie to death. And afterwards, they turned on Leah, and Lawrence would squeeze her throat while Norris hit her head several times with a sledgehammer. They threw both of the victims off a cliff with the ice pick still embedded in her skull. Now, on Sunday, September 30th, they ended up raping another victim, Robin. She is an Oregon resident visiting her dad in Manhattan Beach, and she actually declined a lift from the murder mac. They sprayed her with a mace and dragged her kicking and screaming off the sidewalk. But both men raped her in the van, but they were careless, and she actually ended up escaping. Now, she reported the assault, but she couldn't identify her assailants. She did not remember the license plate, so they were unable to pursue it any further, and she would end up returning to Oregon. Now, remember this story, guys, because it is going to come back. Now, the duo's last known victim was Shirley Lynette Ledford. Now, Bittaker and Norris abducted their final victim, a 16-year-old, on Halloween in 1979. She was just outside a gas station, hitchhiking home from a Halloween party, and she believed, now, investigators believe that she actually accepted a ride from Bittaker because she recognized him from her job at McDonald's. Now, she was quickly gagged and tied up with duct tape. This time, they chose not to go to their secluded spot, though. They thought, yep, you know what? We can rape and torture her while we just drive around the suburbs of Los Angeles. When Norris actually took the driver's seat, Bittaker would turn on a tape recorder and went on to tape record her. There was tape recordings of her being slapped and demanding her to speak, and it was just they would switch places and they'd record her her murder basically, and her rape and torture. There's this transcription. There is a transcript, guys, of what they did to her. I'm not going to give that airtime, guys. There is no need to hear a dying woman's pleas to not be killed and to hear a woman going through that amount of torture. If you do want that particular transcript, feel free to add it into the comment section, and I will add the link for you. I didn't read it all just because as a woman, I didn't even want to read it. Norris would end up hitting her over 25 times with a sledgehammer, and they would kill her like they did the first victim, Cindy, with a coat hanger with pliers. Now, I don't know if this was to sensationalize it or the Hillside Strangler had just been caught and he thought, well, you know what? Screw it. I'm gonna show these police exactly who we are. But he discarded her body on a random lawn in order to see a reaction from the press. Now, the pair drove to a randomly selected house and they put her on a bed of ivy upon a front lawn. Now, Roy Norris, his bragging would lead to their capture. In November 1979, he reconnected with a fellow criminal, a friend this time from the California Men's Colony. He confided in him regarding what he and Bittaker had been doing over the past 5 months. He'd also confessed to 3 additional incidents in which they abducted young women and they raped and tortured them, but they had gotten away. Now, after these confessions, this particular criminal consulted his attorney, who advised him really quickly, you need to inform the authorities of this. So him and his attorney then notified the Los Angeles Police Department, and this ended up relaying them to the Hermosa Beach Police. Side note, Hermosa means beautiful in Spanish, just in case any of my friends didn't know that. A Hermosa Beach detective by the name of Paul Bynum was assigned to investigate Jackson's claims. I had the criminal's name as Jackson, but I'm not sure that that's actually correct. So I will just say a criminal. He was told to investigate these confessions, attempted abductions and rapes. Now, this detective initially noted that the confessions did seem to match reports of several teenage girls who'd been reported missing over the past 5 months. Now, in addition to this, the incident that Norris confided into this particular criminal, where he claimed him and Bittaker had sprayed mace in the face of a woman and that she'd been dragged back to the van and raped by both men, matched a report filed in relation to this particular incident. In this report, a young woman by the name of Robin had been sprayed in the face with the mace before being dragged into a van and being raped by 2 men. They were in their mid-30s. So although she'd reported the abduction and the rape to the police, they were unable to identify who her assailants were. Now, it would actually lead to this detective sending an investigator to visit Robin in Oregon to show her a series of mugshots. Now, without even a second thought, she actually positively identified 2 photos that were presented to her as the men who kidnapped and raped her. Now, these 2 individuals were Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. It's so unfortunate because when she was taken into a police lineup, she wasn't able to identify them. I think that shows me that there was a lot of fear from her perspective. She just didn't know how to identify these people. Now, this detective would approach Deputy District Attorney Steve Kay, who'd actually prosecuted Norris before. He advised patients to build a really strong case despite the massive amounts of urgency. Police would watch the pair, and Norris was caught stealing marijuana on the street on the very same day at a motel in Burbank. Bittaker was arrested for the rape of Robin Roebuck. A search of Lawrence's apartment would reveal several Polaroid photographs which would show Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, and both were reported missing at the time. Inside the motor van, investigators would discover a sledgehammer, a plastic bag full of lead weights, a book detailing how to locate police frequencies, a jar of Vaseline, 2 necklaces, which were later confirmed as belonging to 2 of the victims, and a tape recording of a young woman screaming and repeatedly begging for mercy while being tortured and sexually assaulted. Now, they would also find a bracelet from Shirley Ledford in Norris's apartment. And additionally to this, both Bittaker and Norris had about 500 Polaroids of teenage girls and young women, mostly obviously taken without their knowledge. This is at Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, and a Burbank high school. Now, Roy Norris quickly waived his rights to counsel and he sparred with the detectives for a little while. He eventually crumbles, casting himself as a reluctant accomplice to murders planned and carried out by Lawrence Bittaker. The prison code demanded that he go along for the ride. That's what Norris insisted. After all, he owed Bittaker his life, but apparently not his silence. Now, I read somewhere, and I didn't know if I wanted to include this, but now I've decided I actually do, that Lawrence Bittaker apparently saved Roy Norris's life in prison. Now, you also have to remember there is a code in prison about rapists and pedophiles. So I'm wondering whether in some way, shape or form that Lawrence saved his life in respect of being tortured by other prisoners. My personal thing is, you do it, it should get done to you. But that's me. A little bit of, eye for an eye on that one. So based on Norris's confession, though, both individuals were charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, as well as additional charges, including kidnapping, robbery, rape, deviant sexual assault, and criminal conspiracy. Now, each defendant tried to blame the other one for their disgusting acts. Like, let's be honest. Norris then also claimed later that he was high on drugs most of the time and he was unable to resist Lawrence Bittaker. But the audio tapes definitely told a very different story. It showed that Norris was a full participant. Now, he realised he would have to do more to avoid the death penalty. So in February 1980, Norris accompanied Detective Paul Bunham, Steve Kay, and members of a search party, and he would take them to the San Gabriel murder sites. That was where they would discover the remains of Leah Camp and Jackie Gilliam, with Bittaker's ice pick still lodged in her ear. However, unfortunately, they were never able to find traces of Cindy Schaffert or Andrea Hall. But despite this, he was able to provide sufficient evidence to secure a plea bargain. So in March 1980, he pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder. This is in relation to Andrea Hall because he really wasn't there for that murder. 2 counts of rape and 1 count of robbery. On May 7th in 1980, he was sentenced to 45 years to life imprisonment with an eligibility for parole in 2010. Scum. Should have never had any rights to parole. Don't care whether you confessed. You should have never had any rights to parole. On April 24th, 1980, though, Bittaker was arraigned on 29 charges of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and murder, in addition to various charges of criminal conspiracy and possession of a firearm. He was also charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, dating from December in 1979, in which he'd unsuccessfully but tried to persuade 2 inmates to murder Robin to prevent her from testifying at his upcoming trial. Now, unfortunately, the charges for the rape of Robin would later be dropped because of a lack of physical evidence, as well as her failure to identify her attackers in a lineup. I feel for her because she was, at the end of the day, one of the big reasons why they were caught. And for her to not get any justice is just disgusting. Now, his old mate Norris would testify against him during his trial, and the 17-minute tape of the murder of Shirley Ledford was played. There is some serious damning evidence right there. He testified his own trial and lies absolute arse off. So in February 1981, 3 days after deliberation, the jury would find him guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 9 counts of rape, 2 counts of forcible oral copulation, 1 count of sodomy, and 3 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm. It was deliberated whether he should receive the death penalty or life without parole. They deliberated for, I want to say, just over 90 minutes, so an hour and a half, before they returned a verdict of sentence to death. Now, I've got to say, you really did deserve it. So did Norris, to be honest. They both deserved it, in my opinion, and I do understand that the judicial system, like it is that he helped, I just don't get it. He apparently showed absolutely no emotion as the verdict's delivered. He would stare really hard, though, at the jurors. He then appeared. So then one of the judges, Judge Thomas Fredericks, then ordered Bittaker to appear in court on March 24th for his formal sentencing. This is what the prosecutor, Stephen Kay, said at the death of Lawrence Bittaker. I'm upset that he beat the system. He died of a natural death, something that his victims didn't have a chance for. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They never got to get married, have children, or have grandchildren. I couldn't agree more, because he died of natural causes. Norris even died of natural causes in February 2020. This is the part that really frustrates me, guys. These guys wait on so long for death row, and then they end up dying of natural causes. It is no justice for victims. Absolutely. Just none. Now, thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode. If you like this podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you go back and you watch the other videos or the other episodes. Go and watch some of my videos on my dogs, on my cats. I do have a TikTok. I have an Instagram. Please feel free to go and subscribe and go and like some of those videos. I do some random ones just for fun. But if you are new, welcome and thank you for listening. Otherwise, guys, have a great weekend, my fellow peanuts.